Although the events we commemorate on Anzac Day happened nearly 110 years ago, they remain as relevant today as they were then. Wars have continued. Men and women have continued to serve, and each year we remember a growing number of veterans. Our image of a veteran might be of a former member of the armed forces, marching in parades and proudly wearing their service medals. Alternatively, it may be of a gravesite in a war cemetery marking where they were buried, or a cenotaph representing all the dead from a particular town. But we shouldn't forget that veterans have not always been recognised, and they sometimes don't achieve the level of recognition they deserve. Others prefer to keep their service a secret, not revealing details, even to closest friends and family. Today, we consider the veterans whose service we can highlight through our personal connection with them. The veterans who live amongst us, living and breathing, or those remembered in the memories and photo albums of staff and students at Ku-ring-gai High School. This idea of the veterans amongst us was sparked by teaching the Shoehorn Sonata, a play specifically written to highlight the plight of army nurses and civilians imprisoned by the Japanese forces after the fall of Singapore in 1942. The play dwells upon the lack of recognition given to prisoners of war through the years. Imagine, as we were reading the play, a student sitting in the class had a poignant story to tell of his own family. This is what happened.
Private Robert Stewart Goulden, the student's great-uncle, was a member of a field ambulance division and left Sydney for Singapore in January 1942, 1 month before it fell to the Japanese.
Captured and sent to a forced labour camp in Burma, repairing an airfield damaged by British bombing, Goulden faced appalling conditions, and one morning, Private Goulden was found missing.
He had escaped. He was found 3 days later by locals, handed to the police, and then back to the Japanese forces.
Punishment for escape was execution, and after being summarily tried, the penalty was duly carried out by firing squad. Private Robert Goulden died at the age of 24, unaware that his wife had just given birth.
His body lies in Tan Bayou Zayat War Graves Cemetery, Burma. He was posthumously awarded a certificate of gallantry, and his surviving family only learned the exact nature of his death in 1995.
Edmund Wallinen, my grandfather, was born in Poland. So when the Germans and the Soviets were carving up Poland in 1939, he was imprisoned in a Russian labor camp, or a gulag essentially, for most of his teenage years.
When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, Edmund was released by the Russians into British hands, and he joined the British Army, Polish 2nd Corps, 3rd Carpathian Infantry Division, 6th Rifle Battalion. He trained in Egypt.
But he was a radio operator, and in those times, radios were these massive kind of backpacks. So he would have been running all around everywhere, trying to take orders, trying to give orders. I actually looked, his rank was equivalent to something like an officer, so he was a non-commissioned officer.
Edmund fought in the Battle of Monte Cassino in the Italian campaign of World War II, one of the fiercest battles in the campaign.
He sustained some sort of injury, so he was hit by artillery shrapnel and had to, leave as an injured soldier, essentially.
After the war, Edmund became a member of the Polish Resettlement Corps, PRC, and received an education in Britain where he learnt English. While campaigning, he heard about Australia and wanted to move there after the war.
To him, he was destined to kind of eventually settle there. And, eventually he would meet my grandmother and they'd have my dad, and then there's me.
Vincent O'Leary, my great-grandfather, born in 1921 in Brisbane, served in World War II.
Vincent served in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force from December 1941 to March 1947. As a member of the 27th Independent Company, He was involved in the Battle of Wau in the highlands of New Guinea, where the company was involved in fierce fighting against a determined Japanese enemy.
In 1943, his company became a commando squadron, continuing to fight in mountainous terrain.
Vincent also served in Bougainville, Solomon Islands. He died in Brisbane in October 1970 at the age of 49.
John Henry Marsden was my grandfather. He went to World War II. He went to Townsville to train for about 6 months, and then he was sent to Wewak in Papua New Guinea, where he spent 2 years.
A former student at Sydney Boys High School, John worked as a clerk before enlisting. He was married to Norma Teresa Marsden.
He didn't see any of his family.
His daughter was born while he was on active service, and he didn't meet her until she was 2 years old. He never liked talking about his war experiences and lived to the age of 80 years old. He died in 2002 and is buried in Castle Hill Cemetery.
My great-grandfather, Wallace Wally Osborne, served in World War II in Australia and the Middle East. He was a truck driver who was responsible for transporting equipment and troops onto the battlefield.
While serving in the war, Wally wrote letters home. All 50 of the letters he wrote are now housed in the library at the Australian War Memorial. He was relatively old when he enlisted in the Army Service Corps, 28 in 1940.
He died in 1991 and he was interred in the Northern Suburbs Crematorium.
My grandfather, Sidney George Kilbourne, was born in Northamptonshire, England in 1898. During World War I, he was a private in the Royal Army Medical Corps and served in East Africa. Germany had a colony in what is now Tanzania, and it was surrounded by British colonies, so there was some conflict in Africa. He became a police officer in southern Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe, in the British South African Police Force.
John Howard Fielding was 21 years old when he enlisted in the 15th Infantry Regiment in the Australian Imperial Force on October 26, 1914.
John, Nicole's great-granduncle, became one of the first of what was later called the Anzacs. He embarked for Europe on the HMAT Ceramic A40 at Melbourne on the 27th of December 1914, the last time he would set foot on home soil. Landing at Gallipoli in April 1915, his unit was engaged in heavy fighting, and it sustained heavy casualties.
He was reported killed in action on 30th of April 1915 and buried the next day at Quinns Post Cemetery, Gallipoli. Most of the bodies buried at these sites were unidentified and unknown.
The personal inscription on his memorial reads, "Greater love hath no man than this."
Lance Corporal Hugh Lamont was my great-great-great-uncle. He went to Gallipoli. He was in the 42nd Battalion.
Hugh was 23 years old and departed Melbourne in May 1915. He arrived at Gallipoli just in time for the Australian withdrawal and was then posted to the Western Front. Reaching the rank of Lance Corporal, he was reported as dying on the 27th of May 1916 in France. He was buried in the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Erkingham Cemetery Extension, France.
He unfortunately died by his own rifle. The horrors of war, lest we forget.
To me, he represents a lot of stories, a lot of veterans' experiences of essentially having their life taken away, everything they owned, everything they knew, and they had to start completely fresh and start a whole new life. And I think that is a really powerful experience that we should continue to kind of tell. So I love talking about his story, and yeah, it's great to share it.
Do you have veterans in your family? This Anzac Day, consider attending a commemoration near you and honour the memory of those who served, lest we forget.